Hello, hello, Michael J. here. Today we're going to talk Canadian politics. Now we're going to refer to, as a reference, the Good Talk. Now the Good Talk is a panel of three people: Peter Mansbridge, Chantal Hébert, and Bruce Anderson. And hopefully I got Chantal's name correct. So let's go, before we go to the main screen, the topics are going to be, this is about call the election soon for Canada, because we've got an election that'll be scheduled for October 2025, but the discussion here is the byline, call the election soon. And Chantal's pushing call the election soon because that gives whoever is the new leader a mandate. Okay? I totally disagree. I say do not call an election soon. So this is my viewpoint. So let's hear them out first, and let's go to the main screen. Let's see what they got to say. Let's see what they have to say. Wise guy, eh? Absolutely, Mo.
That the election would be in the fourth year, next year. That's when it's scheduled. That's when most of the talk is about. But now one of the esteemed members of this panel is suggesting, no, let's get at it. Let's get at it now. There's lots of reasons to get at it now. Should be an election now. And there she is to explain her theory on this one, Chantal Hébert.
So calendar-wise, I am not suggesting a Christmas election. It's still 2025. What I am suggesting...
Thank God. Christmas would not be a good time, no matter how you slice it. What's Santa going to say about it? What am I going to say about it? And the nation will be interested in Christmas things. As diverse as our electorate may be, culturally, it's not a good time. I agree.
Is to have an election sooner rather than later in 2025, and to have that election happen on a call by the Prime Minister and not on the eventual day, which most observers expect to happen after the next budget.
Okay, I agree. Yeah, called by the Prime Minister. But what I think is he wait till October 2025. That's just my point of view, and I'm sticking by it.
Government is defeated. The reason I got to that reasoning, and I have absolutely no religion on the election date, and I had none until the presidential election. Then I started to think in terms of public policy. I listened to Mr. Trudeau and his ministers explain that they'd seen this before, that they were going to tackle it again, and that they'd done rather well the first time that Donald Trump was president of the United States, all of which is totally true. But then I also watched what's happening in Washington and how some of the new hires for the Trump cabinet are talking openly about Justin Trudeau, who is not in 2024-25 the Justin Trudeau who was leading in the polls, looking at 3 years in office, and could command the support of a bipartisan, multi-partisan group to support him in his efforts with Donald Trump. And I came to a couple of conclusions, and this has been, my thinking on this is changed from day to day this week. The first is from a public policy perspective. We will have an election in 2025. There is no getting around that.
Indeed.
It will, at the latest, take place next October, meaning we would be in a campaign at the end of the summer. Most of us expect that will come earlier. It will come in the spring. So there's no, we're accelerating, changing our calendar here. That is the reality of the calendar. Until that election takes place, there is absolutely no reason why people in Washington who already think that Justin Trudeau isn't such a great person would want to take him seriously. He brings to the table.
Well, the possibility from south of the 42nd parallel is the fact that these guys think if they push Trudeau out of the way, they might have a better chance of getting their way with whoever replaces him. Now, nobody's thinking about that perspective whatsoever. I just want to make that clear.
For the challenges that will be coming our way soon. Very, very little political capital. I'm trying to say politely that the inclination for anyone who is called upon to interact with the current Canadian government or its prime minister is going to be to wait Mr. Trudeau out and see what happens to him in the election. That's already the case in this country, where provinces, premiers, groups are waiting him out. They're basically saying, well, you know, if you show up again this time next year, maybe we'll talk to you and see where we go from there, which puts him and puts the country in a very weak position.
Now, I disagree with that weak position because of that, with the premiers and provinces. And I'll explain a little bit. I'll pontificate a little more in depth later.
I'll give you one example of that weakness. Canada is host of the G7 next June. That's, luck of the draw, put it this way. It will also be most likely Mr. Trump's first visit to Canada.
If he shows up.
To host the G7 summit, it requires having public servants, high-level diplomats, lay the groundwork for the agenda. That is very much tied to the Prime Minister's vision and strategy going into a G7 summit. The way that the calendar is working out politically at this point, we could be weeks or days before that summit takes place in June, and the Prime Minister who might end up chairing that meeting might not be the Prime Minister that any of the civil servants and diplomats picked by the current Prime Minister prepared for. So that, from a public policy perspective, I came as we would be better served with an election earlier rather than later, so that whoever shows up in June, and I'm not saying Pierre Poilievre would be better than Justin Trudeau or the reverse, shows up in June is someone who has a fresh mandate, not someone who is either just coming in and improvising or is someone who is at the very end of his or her shelf life as leader of the current government because an election. Then I started thinking some more and I thought, okay, but wouldn't it also be to the Liberals' advantage to actually election happen sooner rather than later? Oh, yeah, the polls are really bad. For 2 years, Justin Trudeau has been trying and failing to find a rationale and a narrative to bring to Canadians in an election. He has one now. One of his larger success, one that no one quarrels with, has been his handling of the Trump administration in that first term. And for sure, one of the ballot box issues in the upcoming Canadian election will be, who do you want to lead Canada and face the challenges that the next 4 years will bring on the Canada, US, and geopolitical front?
But here's the thing. This is what everybody's will fail to understand. And I'm going to bring it to the forefront. Number one, the Democrats failed to acknowledge, and this is the issue here in Canada also, and it's the inflation boondoggle. Inflation's number one, and immigration's number two. And one thing about Pierre Poilievre, he's learned from watching the American politics and Doug Ford, and they're just copycats. The scare tactics. They've always used it, but they've ramped it up a great deal. So one is inflation. Number two is immigration. Those are the two key cards at play either side of the border, which motivated the electorate to vote Trump. Number one was inflation. Number two was immigration. So we got the same problem up here. So do not forget that.
So if Mr. Trudeau really wants to go in a campaign with a reason to put the Canadians as to why they should pick him again, and if he wants to be on the offensive and be the one who frames the electoral conversation, it would actually be to his advantage in the circumstances to be the one who actually takes the initiative of calling an election rather than going in that campaign as the lame duck whose government was finally defeated in the House of Commons. And that's basically where I'm at. Public.
Now, because see, this is why I got to disagree, because if he's calling the election and he figures the fact that I've dealt with Trump in the past and I'm best positioned to deal with a second Trump government as being an advantage, it won't be an advantage, because all the electorate in Canada has first and foremost on their mind is number one, inflation, number two, immigration. They figure like they will with Pierre Poilievre that the immigration problem will go, because that's what the U.S. population thought with Trump. And they're going to think about that way here in Canada. Trump's going to take care of the immigration problem. Pierre Poilievre will take care of the immigration problem. This is all they're thinking about, inflation and immigration. And here's the other thing, and this is the number one stumbling block, and this is where Trudeau's got to get his message out, is the fact that inflation is not a result of his government. It's a result of the pandemic. It's a result of the stimulus that had to go in to help the people and lessen the pain and suffering. And because of the pandemic, you had a situation where you had inflation. And the inflation, because of the stimulus, but also was further magnified by the supply chain issues. Because of the work situation around the world, supply chain issues, and inflation's tied into supply and demand. So now you had a situation where people were hurt. So pain and suffering was caused by the pandemic. Inflation reared its ugly head because that's just a natural byproduct of all the factors related to the pandemic. And so you got pain upon pain. And all they're looking at, and this is where the Democrats missed it in the States, they just blamed it on the current government. Simple as that. They've got no historical record or ability to actually put things in perspective within a timeline, and nobody's presenting it that way. Mainstream media is not presenting it that way. They didn't in the United States, and we're not doing it here in Canada. Simple as that. Okay, I put my 2.5 cents out there. Let's go back to the program.
Policy, good, and eventually politics from the Liberal perspective, better than the alternatives.
Okay, Bruce, what do you make of that argument?
Well, first of all, this is an example of why I love this format more than I used to love At Issue. No disrespect to At Issue. That's a very, very interesting set of thoughts that Chantal put on the table. And when you wrote me yesterday and said that this was something that Chantal wanted to talk about, I thought, yeah, that was an interesting idea. You first said she wants an election now, or she's going to advocate for an election now. And then I was thinking, well, I don't know about that timing. That doesn't make that much sense to me. And of course, then she just defused that right out of the gate. But I'm still not quite on the same page as Chantal, but I do think there's a lot in what she says. And let me start by saying I completely agree that Justin Trudeau has been searching for a narrative for 2 years. He has not found one. I absolutely believe that the risks that Trump 2.0 poses for Canada are by far the biggest risks that I can recall in the Canada-US relationship. They are many times greater, as I see it, than the risks in the first Trump term.
Not only that, they predate Richard Nixon, Tricky Dicky, the Watergate fiasco, and Fuddle Duddle. Just saying, folks. Just had to throw that out there.
It is like 5x Trump in terms of the direct challenges that this administration will pose to the way that things work in Canada. And so it's a huge, huge political question. What kind of leadership will Canada want? This is where I think the argument that Justin Trudeau could find some traction both has merit, but also it's kind of hard to see him being able to do something with it. It has merit because I think Canadians are uncertain at this point whether or not the best approach with Trump and his cabinet picks, very, very controversial ones, we'll get to that, I'm sure, is to show strength or to show a spirit of compromise. Let me put it that way. But essentially, I think people are going to be looking at it and they're going to go, is our best posture to go in there and draw some lines and use some clear language, to be crisp, not just to say, you know, we'll figure it out, we'll get along, we'll find some way to paper over our differences and arrive at a point where not very much changes. I could make the argument based on historical Canadian public opinion that that is what people will want. But equally, the more disruptive Trump's cabinet ministers are, the more disruptive the Trump administration is. You could make the case that what Canadians will rally around is a more vigorous and forceful and crisp defense of Canada's interests, even if they know on some level that that's a bet that could lose, that Trump could overwhelm that language with actions that are harmful to our economy. So I think there's the potential there. The question for me is whether or not Justin Trudeau, at this stage in his political career, has the agility, the boldness, the ability to speak in compelling ways to take advantage of that opportunity. Most of the evidence to me so far is he does not.
Yeah, but here's the rub. You gotta do the rub. Jagmeet Singh, is that right? And Pierre Poilievre are not going to perform better than Trudeau. Cut and dry. They just do not have the political savvy on an international scale to be able to pull it off. Singh may to a degree, but I don't know. Between Poilievre and Singh, you know, the egos are pretty strong, which might cloud their ability to apply reason. And if you cannot apply reason to past experience, because they won't have the past experience, that could be a great disadvantage. Just saying, Bruce.
Is that he's got energy, but he doesn't take bold action. He doesn't have agility in the context of recognizing what a pivot really looks like for a population that is screaming, we want something different. Every time he reads that, he delivers something that sounds more like the same, to the ridiculous point that by some measures, Donald Trump is more popular than Justin Trudeau among Canadians. I don't want to go too far with that, but...
No, you make a great point, and it is a valid point, and it really is a point, because it is a fact. And that's why Pierre Poilievre has done so well. And it really has a lot to do with the... I'm going to put it out there, and this is not going to be taken lightly by the crowd, because this is going to push their ego, and their ego is going to push back. But the issue is electorate ignorance. I can't paraphrase it any other way. Electorate ignorance. They're not looking at the big picture. They're only thinking about themselves. And what do I mean by that? You have a certain state of apathy, and this is what's driving the American. Look at the American biggest election they've had in years. You know, they had January 6th. Give you an example. Biggest election they've had in years. And the voter turnout was apathetic. Now, the Trump administration, we've got a mandate, the people have spoken. Well, guess what? 43.6% of the population, or thereabouts, is all that voted. Less than 50% of the country. And then you take away what the Democrat vote was received by the Democrats, and the Republicans only got 21.6% of the country's vote. 21.6%, less than 22%. And you say that's a irrevocable mandate to do what you want? Give me a friggin' break. That's BS with a capital B and a capital S. I have spoken. You can disagree, because that's allowed.
Donald Trump, when we put that ballot of would you vote for Trump or Harris, got about 35, 36% among Canadians. Now, it's a different ballot question than who would you vote for in Canada. But Justin Trudeau's favorables are more like 35, 65 in Canada right now. So I think there is an opportunity there to have a different discussion about what the country wants. I don't think that that the way that Trump 2.0 is turning out is as much opportunity for Poilievre before these cabinet nominations as after. And what I mean by that is I think that if Trump was going to be what people kind of expected of Trump, pushing for tariffs, pushing for economic advantage, acting like a predator, but kind of predictably, that probably would have worked significantly to Pierre Poilievre's advantage. People would have looked at him and said, you know what, he'll speak the same language. There won't be this kind of personal tension. He'll be in favor of deregulation, just like Trump is, and maybe that'll be a good thing. Maybe they'll find some common ground together. With the kind of shocking appointments that Trump is making, I don't think this is clear an opportunity for Pierre Poilievre. I think it could become a situation where Canadians start to see this Trump administration unfold and say, what we don't need is...
Exactly, Mr. Anderson. I agree fully. This is a very good point, and this is where you have to pay attention, folks.
Somebody who sounds like a junior version of Trump, or somebody who kind of admires Trump, or somebody who's going to go along with Trump. And I'm not saying that it's clear that that's what Poilievre would do, but I think that the chemistry and the dynamic and the political calculus has definitely changed in the wake of those appointments.
And this is why I say we need to wait till October 2025 for the election. Now, if the other parties force an election earlier, that is a situation we'll have to deal with, nonetheless. Which would be rather unfortunate. Because really, if you think about it, the only way this government here in Canada has operated half decently is with the Liberals in power and NDP supplying the support. The Bloc made a demand, and then just once their demand wasn't met, which was a big demand, like nobody can take that one lightly. That requires a lot more thought and a lot more collective effort across the nation in order to incorporate. It's a great idea. It'd be wonderful if you could just implement it like that, but this requires a little work. That's the issue. And for the Bloc to say, well, if you don't take my demand, I will just friggin' turn my back on you and force an election. And that's not a good place to be at. Not in this period in time, in history, and it does nothing other than help that of which does not need help. It doesn't help the population of Canada. It doesn't help the people. And you got to remember why these people are in power. to serve the people. So until they balance everything to serve the people, they got to be careful what they throw out there. Just saying, folks.
Okay, I know that Chantal wants to get in on this. If you're watching on YouTube, you watch Chantal doing a dance around her microphone.
It's dead. It is gone.
I watched the dance. It wasn't Bizet, but I
I'll let you
watched
in
it.
here in a moment. I just want to say on Bruce's point that I talked to, his last point. I talked to, a number of conservatives before the U.S. election, and almost uniformly they said the best thing that could happen for Polyev is that Trump doesn't win, because it's just going to be one problem after another, and he will be seen as a partner of Trump's, not as
But the only way that partner effect will play out is if the election is put off till October. That's the key element. Peter Mansbridge brought up a very important point, and the only way it's going to have cause and effect is if the election in Canada happens at the designated time, which by law will be October 2025.
in opposition to Trump. Anyway, that's history now. That's not the case. We want to talk about the appointments in the cabinet and how they've affected, and one of the big key issues, immigration. But first, Chantal wants to respond to Bruce.
Well, a couple of points. First of all, my premise is not whether Justin Trudeau would have the advantage over Poilievre or Poilievre over Trudeau. I think that's something for Canadians to decide in an election. That election is inevitable, and whether it is Poilievre or Trudeau, I believe that we should select whoever will be doing this sooner rather than later, so that that person is prepared to handle those challenges. I am also not saying that I'm taking for granted that Mr. Trudeau is staying. I think we should walk away from that conversation at this point, because there are larger fishes to fry than forever speculating about whether he's going to take a walk in the snow on his birthday at Christmas. I am also not saying that a Liberal campaign that would be designed to equate Pierre Poilievre with Donald Trump would be successful. I believe that would be a recipe for disaster for the Liberals. I don't think they can make that stick, especially after what we've seen over the past 2 weeks. The differences between Pierre Poilievre and Donald Trump, if anything, are becoming more stark as a result of all those appointments. What I was thinking about is something that we all saw, which was the free trade election, which was the one election where Canada-US relations dominated the conversation to a level that I have not seen since, and I had not seen before. Now, that election wasn't about John Turner is bad and Brian Mulroney is good, but I spent that campaign, I spent 2 weeks with John Turner, the first two, then I spent 10 days with Ed Broadbent, and then after the debate, I spent the last end of the campaign with Brian Mulroney. I have a good memory for stuff that I've covered. After that first week, with some mishandled announcements from the Liberals on other issues, I can't remember anything except free trade as a debate. Whenever I look at excerpts of that leaders' debate, the only excerpts I see are all about free trade and the free trade deal. Now, what were other issues that did not get discussed because of the free trade thesis, and why Brian Mulroney should have been happy that they were not? One of those was abortion rights. The Morgentaler ruling came in January '88. We went to the polls in the fall of '88 with the situation unresolved by the government. The other issue that was very little discussed is the Meech Lake Accord. There was an asset in Quebec, but was it debated in the election campaign?
That's a good point, but I'm not sure how that has anything to do with now. And the reason why I say that is John Turner was a lawyer, spent most of his lunch hours at Winston's at 104 Adelaide Street West. Why do I know that? I hung out with the Rosedale crowd. One of the partners of Davies, Ward and Beck And I understand where John Turner was at that point in time. I believe he lived on Nanton Avenue in Rosedale at that time. Could be wrong. That's where David Owen lived, but I'm pretty sure it was. And David Owen's father was the lieutenant governor of British Columbia. So I'm going to digress a bit, but I don't think this is a relevant point of view. Because it is relevant in a way right now because Doug Ford is talking about bumping out Mexico. And I'm going to just jump ahead in the conversation here because I wasn't going to initially, but this is where the immigration card comes into play. Inflation, number one, was the factor that pushed Trump in. And number two was immigration. Now, the U.S. has 345 million people. 10 to 12 undocumented workers that they know of. Why they say they're undocumented, they know of them. And this is where Canada, we've got the same issue because Trudeau just had to, because of pressure from the other parties, limit the immigration. Because a lot of people are claiming the problem with the economies south of the 42nd parallel, north of the 42nd parallel, have to do with immigration. And that's a misnomer. You look at Doug Ford, you know, he's a wild card. He's an ignoramus. Sorry, plain and simple. Guy is an ignoramus. First of all, he's giving everybody $200 to go $3 billion in debt. He got $9 billion from the feds during COVID, sat in the cash, built up stockpiles. The healthcare system on Ontario has not recovered from the effects of 1985 of a guy by the name of Mike Harris. Common sense revolution. Pierre Poilievre now. Common sense revolution. All these commercials. Common sense. Let's get back to common sense. Do you see a trend here? These are the real issues at play. Immigration is not the problem because of rents being so high, price of houses being so high. Doug Ford has taken over the engine of Canada now is Ontario. Doug Ford, Premier, has taken away rent controls. A lot of the properties in the province are now controlled by corporations, and they call them financialized property owners. So everything is out of whack. It's out of balance. The fiat currency system around the world no longer serves the people, and nobody's addressing that. But on the interim, the two things that are up and foremost, front and center, inflation and immigration, both sides of the border. That is it. Back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Outside Quebec? No, it was not, because we were talking about the FTA. That was good for the government, as it turned out. And the third issue that was not much discussed was the incoming GST. When the election was called, we already knew that the manufacturer's tax was going to be phased out and the GST was going to come over the course of that successive mandate. So all those issues that were troublesome to a degree for the government kind of faded away because of the larger discussion. Now, the FTA may have justified that conversation, but looking at what's going to be dominating political news over the next 6 months, I suspect that the Trump challenges will eclipse in the Canadian conversation many of the other issues that should have been front and center in the Canadian election.
Okay. Bruce, you get 1 minute. Go.
All right. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm not sure that it would work out well for the Liberals or poorly for the Conservatives, but I do believe that there's every evidence that this issue of how Canada deals with the United States can become the compelling issue. in the coming year. In fact, I think it's almost certain that that will be the case because there's so many aspects of it. And because the pugilistic approach of some of the early cabinet appointees is going to put some issues squarely on the table. And I'm
going to interject again. It can be, providing you give the time to allow those issues to percolate to the top, to the forefront. But still, irrespective of that, you're discounting how important on the mind of the people is inflation. It's pocketbook, baby. Inflation and then immigration. Both of those hit the pocketbooks of the average Canadian citizen. It did with the United States, and it's the same with the Canadian population as well.
I think that I don't imagine a situation where everybody's going to immediately go, well, we need these guys to handle this, or we need those folks to handle that. But I do think that if politicians kind of firm up their positions, Trudeau and Poilievre in particular, then people will have a choice that they'll find quite compelling and interesting. And it might not mean that the election is only about fatigue with incumbents and the price of food and fuel and housing. I don't know what the right policy approach is. And so I want to be clear that this is above my pay grade to say we should draw a line and say we'll never talk about water, as opposed to, well, maybe there is a 100-year-long contract about water that...
Okay, I'm going to cut this one short now. I originally was going to go longer and listen to it more, but I'm not going to. And the reason why I'm not going to is I think everybody must understand that major issues, no matter how you're going to slice and dice this, it's going to be inflation and it's going to be immigration. And waiting till October 2025 for an election is the best interest of the people of Canada, because that'll allow the time for Donald Trump to bring up the card number 3, tariffs. If he incorporates tariffs the way he said he was, he's going to destroy everything Biden's done for the U.S. economy, the 2.8% on an average growth. And he's going to go out the window, and it's going to create a inflation boondoggle like they've never seen before. This is what's going to happen if those tariffs go into play. Now, there's an economist in Massachusetts, Richard Wolff. Very, very pragmatic, because he's got a good sense of feel for for what's really going on. And what's really going on is we've got the United States, which is, the economy is pegged to the American dollar. But here's the wild card. China has been growing and growing and growing because, they had over 6% annual growth. U.S., over the last few decades since Nixon, not averaging 6% annually. Give us a break. It ain't happening. And then George Wilbur. Anyways, George Bush Jr. decides to get into a war, spend $1 billion a day. Gave China the opportunity to become the dominant force in the world arena. But damn, Chinese say, I can't do a thing about it. Chinese couldn't do a thing about it because they're holding so much in paper, in American dollars. And it was hard for them to chew on, but they had to. It also allowed for the Han Dynasty to come into play, which is Xi Jinping. And we're not going down that rabbit hole right now at this point or this juncture. But nonetheless, the U.S., because they've kept wages down, as this has been a Republican thing, Wages, I think, are what, $7.50, and they keep refusing to increase it. Even after COVID, they refused to. And Democrats wanted it $15 an hour. Meanwhile, in the state of Iowa, they had to put the wage advertised for $15 an hour for restaurant help because they couldn't get people. So the reason why the Republicans keep it at 7 and change is because corporations and the people that invest in the stocks and bonds are the top 10% of the population. And they've been benefiting by the economies since Richard Nixon. And now they can't give up to the people. They need to benefit further, take what they can while they can. Because what happens if BRICS, now if you think about BRICS, B-R-I-C-K-S, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, a lot of African countries, a lot of resources there. Anyways, the GDP of BRICS far outweighs the G7 now. So that puts at risk the American dollar being pegged to the financial system worldwide. And this is a major thing that people are missing. So just leave that with you. And on that basis, we're going to exit. Send love and peace to everybody. Thanks for watching. Questions, comments, throw in chat. And we're going to end with our two favorite characters. And this is what we recommend. Instead of watching mainstream media and being brainwashed, do what these two guys are going to do right here. Love and peace to everyone. Till the next time. Ciao.